Welcome back to the course Cooperative Individualism, the third way to the just society. We've reached lesson 5, titled Cooperative Individualists Survive as a Fringe Community. From the perspective of cooperative individualists, the 20th century proved to be a period of almost continuous attacks on efforts to secure and protect fundamental human rights. These attacks were both overt and covert, shrouded in ideological language, nationalist fervor, and moral relativism. In the last year of his life, Henry George, worn out physically and struggling to fight off the debilitating effects of a stroke, delivered an address worthy of extensive review. Here's what he had to say. Though we may not speak it openly, the general faith in democratic institutions, where they have reached their fullest development, is narrowing and weakening. It is no longer the confident belief in democracy as the source of national blessings that it once was. Thoughtful men are beginning to see its dangers without seeing how to escape them. They are beginning to accept the view of Macaulay and to distrust that of Jefferson. The people at large are becoming used to the growing corruption. The most ominous political sign is the growth of a sentiment which either doubts the existence of an honest man in public office or looks on him as a fool for not seizing his opportunities. That is to say, the people themselves are becoming corrupted. Where this course leads is clear to whoever will think. As corruption becomes chronic, as public spirit is lost, as traditions of honor, virtue, and patriotism are weakened, as law is brought into contempt and reforms become hopeless, then in the festering mass will be generated volcanic forces which will shatter and rend when seeming accidents give them vent. Strong, unscrupulous men, rising up upon occasion, will become the exponents of blind popular desires or fierce popular passions, and dash aside forms that have lost their vitality. The sword will again be mightier than the pen, and in carnivals of destruction, brute force, and wild frenzy will alternate with the lethargy of a declining civilization. Henry George had never been comfortable with the public reference to his principles as a call for a, quote, single tax on the value of land. His was a campaign for justice, for equality of opportunity, for true liberty and against privilege in all its forms. His vision embraced the principles of cooperative individualism. He had devoted his life to ending privilege. Those who enjoy privilege do not always recognize the privilege they enjoy. Others, even when deeply committed to improvement of the human condition, do not reach the same conclusions as to cause. Here, for example, is how Theodore Roosevelt responded in 1886 to a supporter of Henry George when campaigning against George for the office of mayor of New York City. Roosevelt stated, "The mass of the American people are most emphatically not in the deplorable condition of which you speak, and the statesmen and patriots of today are no more responsible for some people being poorer than others than they are for some people being shorter, or more nearsighted, or physically weaker than others. If you had any conception of the true American spirit, you would know we do not have classes at all on this side of the water. Some of the evils of which you complain are real and can be to a certain degree remedied, but not by the remedies you propose. Others are imaginary, and others, though real, can only be gotten over through that capacity for study, individual self-help, which is the glory of every true American, and can no more be done away with by legislation than you could do away with the bruises which you receive when you tumble down by passing an act to repeal the laws of gravitation." As President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt came to see that the nation's land and natural resources were in great danger of private exploitation without compensation to the public and without regard for permanent environmental damage. In response, he established the principle that no grant of land would be made to any railroad or corporation, and that a system of leaseholds only would be permitted. The death of Henry George in 1897 at a relatively young age was a severe blow to the movement he had initiated, but there remained a sizable core group of powerful supporters to carry on, and enough real-world success for optimism. Progress was reported in the movement's several organs, such as the Single Tax Review. Businessman and former streetcar license monopolist Tom L. Johnson had come to embrace the principles of cooperative individualism after reading one of Henry George's books and then seeking him out in New York. In 1901, Johnson was elected mayor of Cleveland, Ohio, and applied all his energies to turning Cleveland into an efficiently run city with high-quality public goods and services. In 1905, he was drafted to run for governor of Ohio. At a gathering in Akron during the campaign, he told voters what they could expect from him. A tax on land would be an unjust and iniquitous system, but a tax on land values would be the best and fairest system that the world has ever known. Laws which would bring about the taxation of land values would be of more service to humanity than any legislation ever yet enacted. So I say to the farmers here tonight that this single tax, of which I am proud to be an advocate, would be to the overburdened farmers and working men the greatest boon, the greatest blessing, the greatest godsend that any country ever knew. The single tax movement had attracted somewhere in the neighborhood of several 100,000 supporters worldwide. As with all such movements, the number of committed activists was much smaller. Based on the records of conferences held beginning in the 1880s, only about 5,000 different individuals have ever attended at least one of these events. This photograph is from the 1893 conference held in Chicago, Illinois. From George's eldest son, Henry George Jr., came a well-reasoned and successful book in 1905, The Menace of Privilege. The book was a signal that the son of the movement's leader was someone to be reckoned with. In the book he wrote, "The Republic rightly boasts of great achievements, and it has in reserve power for great things to come, but halfway measures will be worse than futile, since they will give growing time to privilege. The one sure way to cure the ills that afflict the nation is to destroy privilege at the root, and that, and only that, accords with the mandates of justice." In 1909, Henry George Jr. fulfilled a long-standing desire to meet with Leo Tolstoy in Russia. He later prepared a brief written record of Tolstoy's thoughts. The land question is indeed the question of the deliverance of mankind from slavery produced by the private ownership of land, which, to my mind, is now in the same situation in which the questions of serfdom in Russia and slavery in America were in the days of my youth. The difference is only that, while the injustice of the private ownership of land is quite as crying as that of slave ownership, it is much more widely and deeply connected with all human relations. It extends to all parts of the world. Slavery existed only in America and Russia, and is much more tormenting to the land slave than personal slavery. It will and must be solved in one way alone, by the recognition of the equal right of every man to live upon and to be nourished by the land on which he was born, that same principle which is so invincibly proved by the teachings of Henry George. After his return to the United States, Henry George Jr. was elected in 1910 to the U.S. House of Representatives and re-elected in 1912. He was plagued by health problems and died in 1916 at the age of 54. Survivors in the campaign for cooperative individualism were given new life by the involvement of Joseph Fels, whose family built a very successful soap manufacturing business in Philadelphia. Before going into a few highlights of his relationship with Henry George and the single tax movement, it is worth quoting from the biography of Fels written by historian Arthur Dudden. When Joseph Fels died in 1914 at the age of 60, he was as famous around the world as William Jennings Bryan and Robert M. La Follette. The fact that he is totally unknown today is a melancholy commentary not only on individual fame, but on the way in which social movements, which in their time enlisted the energies of multitudes of people, can fade out of memory. Even social historians and economists know little of the link between Fels and the single tax movement founded by Henry George. The first that Joseph Fels heard anything about Henry George's movement was in 1891 at a meeting of the Ethical Society in Philadelphia. By 1894, with the United States suffering through a prolonged recession, Joseph Fels was gravitating toward the single tax idea. But he also believed in practical experimentation. When he learned that a single tax colony had been established on Mobile Bay in Alabama, he decided to provide financial assistance, initially to help construct and fill with books a public library. The single tax colony of Fairhope adopted as its founding principles true cooperative individualism, as written by founding resident Ernest B. Gaston. Gaston wrote, "Our motto is not each for all and all for each, but everyone for himself under the law of equal freedom, not from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, but equal opportunities to all and to the laborer the full product of his labor." In 1901, Joseph Fels moved to London, England, to promote his family's business interests. For several years, his activism took the form of helping to establish cooperative farms to provide work and life support for the unemployed. From time to time, he made public statements against the private ownership of land and opposed pushing immigration to Canada and elsewhere as a response to poverty and unemployment. Fels was also trying to convince Booker T. Washington to embrace Henry George's principles as a key component to the program at Tuskegee Institute for the planned, quote, Negro colonies organized under Tuskegee's auspices. Fels urged that the land not be sold to individuals, but be held by the entire community. Then, in 1907, Joseph Fels became an active supporter of the United Committee for the Taxation of Land Values in London. In a letter to the London Tribune, he wrote, "Whenever there is in any country uncultivated lands and unemployed poor, it is clear that the laws of property have been so far extended as to violate natural right." Bills calling for the taxation of land values had been introduced on numerous occasions beginning in the late 1880s. A real opportunity for passage of legislation occurred after the election of 1906, which brought in a Liberal Party majority. Some 280 members of Parliament signed on to a land values group. Herbert Asquith, who would 2 years later become Prime Minister, had earlier responded to a petition submitted by elected officials of 118 municipalities as follows. "It is right and just that the community should reap the benefit of the increased values which are due to its own expenditures and its own growth. We, the government, desire to have time to carefully consider the best way of giving effect to the principles I have enunciated." Among British leaders, it was the partial conversion of Joseph Chamberlain to the principles of cooperative individualism that reignited interest in the taxation of land values in the British Isles. Chamberlain, Britain's leading proponent of various societal reforms, read Progress and Poverty during 1882. Influenced by what he read, his speeches increasingly raised the issues associated with landed privilege. He called for creating small holdings, the breaking up of big estates, slum clearance, and the taxation of the unearned increment accruing to urban property because of public spending on infrastructure. And then a young Winston Churchill emerged in 1909 from his military experience in South Africa against the Boers to campaign with liberals for a seat in the House of Commons. His speeches from that campaign stressed the central importance of ending landed privilege in Britain. Churchill stated, "It is quite true that land monopoly is not the only monopoly which exists, but it is by far the greatest of monopolies. It is a perpetual monopoly, and it is the mother of all other forms of monopoly. It is quite true that unearned increments in land are not the only form of unearned or undeserved profit which individuals are able to secure, but it is the principal form of unearned increment which is derived from processes which are not merely not beneficial, but which are positively detrimental to the general public. Land, which is a necessity of human existence, which is the original source of all wealth, which is strictly limited in extent, which is fixed in geographical position. Land, I say, differs from all other forms of property in these primary and fundamental conditions. All goes back to the land and the landowner, who in many cases, in most cases, is a worthy person utterly unconscious of the character of the methods by which he is enriched, is enabled with restless strength to absorb to himself a share of almost every public and every private benefit, however important or however pitiful those benefits may be." This is the closest Winston Churchill ever came to fully embracing the principles of cooperative individualism. As his political career unfolded, he demonstrated his deep commitment to protect Britain's constitutional monarchy and the use of military force to defend the British imperial domination over others. Refocusing his attention on movement-building activities in North America, in 1909, Joseph Fels established the Joseph Fels Fund, administered by a commission that included Lincoln Steffens, Tom L. Johnson, Frederick C. Howe, Lewis F. Post, Henry George Jr., and other prominent movement figures. The cause of cooperative individualism might have found a base for expansion had the ideals expressed by the Chinese nationalist leader Sun Yat-sen found their way into a new Chinese constitution. As a young student in France, Sun Yat-sen had read and absorbed Henry George's writings. Interviewed in 1912, he told a group of American reporters, "The teaching of your single taxer, Henry George, will be the basis of our program of reform. The land tax, as the only means of supporting the government, is an infinitely just, reasonable, and equitably distributed tax." What must be said is that many of those who called for the taxation of land values as an essential reform did not publicly embrace the complete philosophical principles of cooperative individualism. Only a few would take on the challenge of running against the wind, as liberalism and social democracy were challenged by Bolshevism, fascism, and other systems of state socialism and totalitarianism. Constructive systemic change was to be threatened from both the left and the right. And with that, we reach the end of Lesson 5.